was not read. I experienced it, being deprived, being oppressed, even confused. It's enough now, we're taking the power back. We're stronger than before, we're prouder, too strong. The worst is over. From Cape to Cairo, Morocco to Madagascar. From Cape to Cairo, Morocco to Madagascar.
Good afternoon and welcome back to the AZAPO online political education series. Today I'm playing host to Comrade Mazibuko Jara. My name is Simpwe Ashe. This is the AZAPO online political education platform. This is where we educate for liberation. Welcome, Comrade Jara, to this platform. All right, let me just do introductions. Mazibuko Jara, he is calling himself a Marxist who is based in Keiskammahoek in the Eastern Cape. He is a member of the Ntinga Ntaba kaNdoda rural movement, a popular educator, researcher, and writer who collaborates with and supports urban and rural social movements on struggles for popular alternatives from below. And what he means by that, he speaks to cooperatives, the solidarity economy, rural democracy, land and agrarian reform, food sovereignty, and agro-ecology. He was the Young Communist League's Deputy National Secretary from 2003 until his expulsion at the end of 2005. He served as the spokesperson and chief strategist of the South African Communist Party from 2000 to 2004. He was expelled from the SACP in 2010 over his critique of the party's support for Jacob Zuma instead of asserting its socialist independence and program. He is the co-founding editor of the Amandla magazine and also a co-founder of the Democratic Left Front, which merged itself into the NUMSA-led United Front. Welcome once more, Comrade Mazibuko, to this platform, and we are very grateful that you have agreed to spend the afternoon with us, and we look forward to having this conversation with you. The conversation that we will be having this afternoon is really looking at the advancement or advancing socialist revolution in a democratic South Africa. And Comrade Mazibuko is going to take us through his thoughts and views and opinions, and he looks forward to your engagement on this very interesting discussion topic. And welcome, Comrade Mazibuko.
Thank you, Comrade Ashe. Thank to AZAPO as well as a whole for this platform and this initiative on sustained political education. And I think of radical Black left discourses and knowledge production. I think.
All right, you've got a presentation that you're going to be sharing with us. And I just want to put it up for you so that you can take us through.
Okay. Thank you. I think before I go to the presentation itself, I want to make a few preliminary remarks. The fact that AZAPO has been convening this platform and initiative since the lockdown is crucial in my view for the left, and also to enable dialogue across historical and ideological divides. Hopefully my contribution will enrich that process. What I'm presenting is not a blueprint but a set of perspectives. I'm also coming to the webinar to learn, to share, to engage, to be engaged, to influence, and to be influenced. Having said that, I'm now moving on to the presentation proper. I think the topic given today, advancing the socialist revolution in a democratic dispensation, in a democratic South Africa, has to grapple with four core questions. One, if we're talking about socialist revolution, what then is socialism? And also, if we're talking about this dispensation, perhaps also if we talk about this current moment. So let's think about what characterizes this moment essentially. And I make a fairly controversial argument about this moment presenting the utter and ultimate defeat of the left. Thirdly, there are a number of questions and threats that we have to consider in the struggle for socialism. I'll take some time to walk through those later on. And essentially, if there has to be a progress in the socialist revolution in a democratic dispensation, we have to reroute the process of left renewal amongst mass struggles, in mass struggles. So those are the four core questions and issues that I walked through in the presentation. Let me take some time then, maybe skip back the slide because I would now speak without referring to the slide itself. I think if we're going to define socialism, there are several elements we have to think about. I suggest at least 7. One, socialism has to concern itself, has to be about the sustainable and regenerative use of ecological resources and systems. 2, the socialization of the economy. 3, in an African context, in a South African context, it has to be about national liberation, which in my view has to mean decolonization and the defeat of white supremacy and racism. 4, it has to be about the liberation of women and other sexually oppressed strata. In other words, the end of patriarchy and heteronormativity. Number 5, a key element has to be democracy. Number 6, a key element has to be about equality. Number 7, a key element has to be about freedom. Let me go in turn then to expand these 7 key elements. Starting with the first one, referring to ecology, the ecological systems. No social system is possible without sustaining and regenerating the biophysical web of life that we need to live. We cannot be extractivist and destructive to nature if we think that we can achieve socialism. Capitalism and Western modernity have accelerated the metabolic rift of humanity from nature to the point of system collapse. That's the crisis we're facing today. Therefore, if socialism is to be valid and relevant, it has to be founded on a new basis. It has to end the extractivist logic as a basis for economic development. It has to introduce ecological sustainable production. It has to ensure that we achieve ecosystem renewal, whilst also at the same time sustainably meeting human needs. And therefore, in that way, it would become relevant and valid for our times and for future generations. In other words, our socialism for this century has to be eco-socialism. The second pillar of socialism, that of the economy, has to start with democratic social ownership of the means of production as the dominant form of ownership. Socialized ownership of land, of water, of minerals, of the oceans, other natural resources, of factories, of banks, and other major means of production. By socialized ownership, I think we have to go beyond state-centric nationalization, but move and conceptualize real, democratic, and collective social ownership. Run affairs of the public and the economy on democratic control from below, and conceptualize the means of production as a commons, and use the means of production to advance the collective social need, the commodified public goods, and essentially ecologically sustainable and regenerative as well. social ownership has to mean that. Also, another key element of a socialist economy is about public financing, publicly run and publicly accountable economic activities, where worker and community control, transparency, productivity and efficiency, organized in a manner meant to meet social needs. But obviously, there has to be diverse forms of public ownership. The state itself, at the national, provincial, and local level, but beyond the state as well, in terms of cooperative and other collective forms of ownership. Those are going to be crucial if we reimagine socialism. The second pillar of a socialist economy, in my view, has to pay attention to the decommodification of public goods, where then we can achieve a significant social wage, public transport, education, health, and so on, in a manner that advances human capabilities. The workplace too has to be transformed when we think about the socialist economy. As I've said already, worker and community ownership are going to be key, but also forms of management have to be collective and democratic. And the system of extracting surplus and value from the labor process has to move away from exploitation, and to be based on dignity, producing socially necessary goods, and the development of human capabilities. In our context, it definitely also has to end the apartheid wage gap and racialized workplace relations. Obviously, it also has to end gender oppression and the promotion of collective advancement of women. That's going to be very key. And also, what happens to the surplus in terms of its distribution and consumption has to be based on a new basis, whereby it's not the profit motive, but redistribution to achieve collective social well-being. Together with that will be a shorter working week, as well as a living wage, together with a full range of socio-economic benefits. The last component of a socialized economy, in my view, cannot be narrow and look at one country, but has to think about the global context, where then I argue for a perspective that says we should go back to Samir Amin's idea of delinking. How do we structure our economy in a way that ensures that we engage with the rest of the world in our own terms, with the rest of the continent, with the rest of the global south, in a way that changes the global political economy. And that's why I think we need to go back to Amin's idea of delinking. That's a quick package in terms of how I think socialism has to rethink the economy. I'm moving now to the next pillar of my framing of socialism, that of national liberation. As I've said, national liberation in our African context of genocide, slavery, colonialism, and white supremacy. Socialism is not just going to automatically lead to Black liberation and the end of racism. Racial oppression requires a clear, explicit, and sustained program by socialists. And in my view, national liberation has to learn from the last 27 years. Therefore, it cannot mean rainbowism. It cannot mean a Black capitalist class or at the same time racial revenge. It has to mean the end of racism and white supremacy. It has to address and dissolve the racialized tensions between so-called Africans, so-called coloreds, and people of Indian origin, and amongst them, forge a new progressive Black identity. It also has to go beyond colonial boundaries, recognize, embrace, and affirm the internationalization of the country's working class, and therefore end xenophobia towards people born elsewhere in our continent. When it comes to white people, I think national liberation from a socialist perspective has to mean the racial and cultural reckoning of white people. In Marxist terms, we've always used the phrase class suicide. Can white people, can socialists and the broad Black working class drive the struggle to the point where white people commit racial suicide and get born anew as Africans in a transformed society? Further, this perspective on national liberation argues that we also have to undertake thoroughgoing, progressive, and emancipatory decolonization of society, of institutions, of systems, of the state, of the constitution, of the legal system, broader socio-economic systems, cultures, identity, heritage, arts, education, and so on. And in this way, that decolonization would not be about a return to some imagined pre-colonial past or an uncritical importation of critical race and decolonial theories from the US and Caribbean, but national liberation in a very particular context. And the last point I want to make with regards to national liberation has to do with language. We need to pay attention to this issue because it's very complex and very divisive, as we're already seeing with elements of ethnic-based politics. I'm moving on now from national liberation to the liberation of women and other sexually oppressed strata. Our socialism will make no sense whatsoever if we do not consciously, deliberately ensure that we defeat sexist and patriarchal discourses in society, where the unpaid social reproduction labor of women is socially and economically recognized, where we consciously take significant steps to reduce the burden of social reproduction labor on women, particularly through shared work, but also through socialization of unpaid labor, for example, with food, for example, with early childhood development and other elements that would ensure that we change that aspect. But also when it comes to policies, programs, and resource allocations, we have to ensure that those are done in a way that advance the position of women. And public goods and decommodification are key here. But also our socialism has to think about a realistic political program of gendered progressive transformation of the home, of the family, of culture, of the community and the economy. And therefore, in all of this, there's critical consciousness that's required, particularly when it comes to a number of cultural assumptions that we erroneously make as a society about the position of women. The point I've made about women can be extended to lesbian and gay people as well as other socially oppressed strata. I'm moving now from this to focus on democracy. Our socialism also has to rethink our imaginations of democracy. The political democracy that we have has to be deepened and extended. I don't think it will be correct to dismiss the right to vote, regular elections, a Bill of Rights, and so forth, but they are limited, obviously, by the neoliberal framework that informs the constitution we have. Therefore, as socialists, how do we go beyond the dominant liberal interpretation to these rights that, in fact, in our country were won by the working class, the Black working class? A key step in that regard would be the radical transformation of the current parliament in terms of public participation, the legislative process, the salaries and perks paid to MPs and ministers, but also beyond the formal political democracy, we have to extend it. For example, the right to recall, the need for a constituency-based electoral system, the public financing of the political system, of political parties themselves, but not just political parties, but also the public participation of ordinary people has to be publicly financed in order to deepen and extend democracy. But also, our system does not really recognize democratic and collective forms of people's power. In the 80s, we used to call these organs of people's power. In my view, our socialism has to rethink these as the basic unit of democratic control, of governance, of legislation, and the budget. Beyond that, there's also the need for direct democracy. We saw it in Marikana. We saw it in FISMA's fall, where non-state social power had an impact. How do we do that now in a manner where it's not just at moments of struggle, but as a continuous logic? The last point I want to make on democracy, it has to do with rural democracy. There's confusion amongst many comrades on the left about asserting. Change the screen, keep it to, I'm not there yet. I've just expanded, yeah, keep it there. The mistake we often make as comrades when we want to think about the rural space, particularly in the former homelands, as the bastion, as the place where customary law, where the chieftaincy has to be protected and defended. And yet we forget how both colonialism and apartheid actually co-opted deformed and thwarted the development of progressive and democratic customary law. And in my view, our democracy as socialists cannot leave this question unaddressed. Mamdani, with reference to Uganda, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, makes the point that the liberation movement did not really think about the democratic question, such that what appeared to be the post-colonial state ended up repeating the scheme of indirect rule, whereby you have urban citizens and rural slaves, rightless rural people and urban citizens with full democratic rights. In our context, the tribal elite that we have is a direct outcome of apartheid and colonial machinations. That we cannot ignore that simply because we want a restoration of African cultural and customary systems. Indeed, Africans in rural and other contexts have to have the space to develop their customary systems, but on a new basis, on a progressive and democratic basis. And in my view, as socialists in an African context, this will be a major contribution we make. I will not spend more time to explain the elements of equality and freedom that I include in my definition of socialism. I was making all those points about defining what socialism would mean, because I think it's critical that we undertake that journey. Otherwise, it's possible that amongst us as the left, we may make reference to different dimensions or different thinking about socialism. At times, comrades draw uncritically from the canon of Marxist theory or from the Soviet experience in a way that does not really enable socialism to be a living body of action and thought. I'm moving now from this introductory engagement with what socialism means to the slide, Comrade Chair, you were presenting. Having put forward some thoughts on what I think socialism is, let's come back then to this moment. In my view, this moment confirms yet again how we as the left, whatever ideological prism we come from, are utterly and ultimately defeated. The implosion of the ANC that we're seeing in front of our eyes should have meant the rise of an alternative from the left, but that's not happening. Instead, we see the hegemonic discourse being that of liberalism in the media and even in how political debates are framed. At the same time, we are seeing a very worrying emboldening of the wide right, whether it's AfriForum, whether it's the Institute of Race Relations, whether it's Solidarity, whether it's Orania and other elements. Now, they can come out, all of them, in the open because the ANC is failing. Whereas initially, if you recall, in the early period post-94, they were somewhat dislodged. But now, because of the ANC's failures, they are well emboldened, and there's no left voice that can challenge that. And the working class in South Africa has given the left enough material to build and reorient society, whether it was Marikana, whether it was anti-privatization strikes, whether it was the movement to form the EFF, or whether it was the NUMSA break, or whether it was the total shutdown movement, or the fees must fall moment. But as the left, we've lost all those moments and opportunities. Now, here's a question that I think we all need to think about. Clearly, there's going to be a whole range of mass upheavals that will continue to surface in this society. When those happen, what will be the state of the left? I think we can no longer let such moments pass without some critical work done to shape and improve the state of the left. I'm moving on now to say, let's then think about some key questions and threats that are facing the left and generally the struggle for socialism in South Africa. The first one I'll deal with at length is what I refer to as a crisis of politics. Whilst we have this declining hegemony and implosion of the ANC, I've already said the left is weak, and the left is competing with the dominance of liberal democracy and NGOism. That liberal democracy and NGOism is the mainstay of political activism among sections of working class communities. This NGOism is on the basis of a reformist understanding of the Constitution and is essentially about the self-organization of the middle class, which has access to donor funds. What we are seeing also is a significant erosion of working class progressive consciousness, which is linked to widespread disillusionment amongst ordinary Black working class people and the lack of hope. The rich tradition we had in the past of popular movements and working class solidarity have declined in a significant way. So in my view, that represents a crisis of politics. The second question that I think, and threat that I think is confronting us is both social and economic. We must remember that our society is socially conservative. Even though this working class in the 80s had produced the most radical demands across the world, but it has remained essentially conservative. If you look at the position of women, if you look at the position of lesbian and gay people, even if you think about the return of ethnicity and tribalism. Given that socially conservative nature of the society, you've now seen the emboldening and rising entrenchment of conservative social, political, and religious forces within the state and outside the state, as well as at the grassroots. And I think this portends the possibility that this can turn mass anger in a Black right-wing direction. A Mashaba who can rise and capture public anger on the basis of ANC failures is dangerous for the socialist revolution. Related to this is the fact of social divisions between so-called Africans and so-called colors. That's a major issue which just weakens working class unity of the kind required, for example, to roll back what's happening in the Western Cape. Part of this social and economic question is also the collapsing social fabric in working class communities. This social fabric is the breeding ground for extreme forms of violence, for brutality and violence against women and children, for rising crime, for gangsterism, xenophobia, and so on. Whilst the working class is faced with all these problems, capital remains inordinately powerful over the state and over the livelihoods of many. I do not have to explain how that happens. As it is powerful, it also has systemic disorganizing effects on ordinary people, whether the working class has to stand in long queues or whether it has to spend hours and hours in poor public transport, or whether it's through low wages or through retrenchments. All of those militate against political organization of the Black working class. What adds to that is collapsing state and public services, which means that even the little that ordinary people were getting is getting stolen away. In the midst of all of these challenges, there is then the ecological question, where vast parts of the country are subject to all sorts of problems: extreme weather events, soil fertility, declining freshwater resources, with huge implications for food security, for the quality of health. And alongside those ecological disasters, we also related to them is the collapsing energy system and transport system, which is quite significant for development, if we remember how underserved when it comes to energy and electricity our townships and rural areas were. In the last question, in my view, that is significant is that one of theory for the left. If we're to be honest with ourselves as the left, have we thought about the post-1994 social formation? In the past, it was the Black majority oppressed by a racial minority, whether you call it a settler colonial minority or whatever we called it. What has happened post-1990, post-1994 in the South African social formation? For example, the rise of informalization and pauperization through retrenchments, through low wages. What does it mean for the makeup of South African society? The rise of the black middle class, what does it mean? The internationalization, or at least the coming into South Africa of significant numbers of, let's go back to the previous slide, of significant numbers of people from the continent. I think that's significant for me in terms of how we understand this society, because it has implications for what strategies we develop then. And then I think it's also important to think about the relationship between reform, transformation, and revolution. I'll expand this later on. I've made the point about women's liberation and feminism, but how do we theorize that from a South African perspective? Similarly, decolonization, I've made that point. The big issue that I don't think we can ignore is race and nation building. What is our rethinking of this in light of the failure of Mandela's nation building project and other dimensions that inform this? Given the earlier input I was making about the ecological crisis, also we have to theorize what I think is relevant as a vision of eco-socialism. Having posed these questions and threats, I think I'm moving towards the conclusion now with a number of proposals, which is the next slide, Comrade Chair. Essentially, what I'm arguing for socialists to think about in a democratic dispensation is a mass-rooted process of left renewal. By stating that the left is weak and utterly defeated, I do not want us to be hopeless. Like Christians, we have to be hopelessly hopeful. And here's my package for hope. One, the working class in South Africa is still restless, is still moving, even if it is poorly politically organized. So therefore, there's a basis for rebuilding mass movements and mass struggles towards radical and vibrant mass movements amongst workers, amongst youth and students, amongst women, amongst lesbian and gay people, amongst rural people, where we have civics and so on. And I think in rebuilding mass movements, there's a need to increase the scope for mass movements to develop a broad anti-capitalist orientation. This is not necessarily given. And I think it has to be worked on patiently, democratically, without imposing from above. But it's logical that as people struggle against the system in terms of the issues they face, they can only, the only logical conclusion has to be an anti-capitalist orientation. We also have to build unity, solidarity, and joint action across the various issues, because at times that does not happen across different geographies, across different movements. And doing that, we will also be contributing to the building of power from below. These immediate struggles then bring us to the question of a long-term vision. Those struggles for reforms in the here and now, yes, they can ameliorate people's conditions. Yes, they can claim the constitution, they can use other democratic rights, but at the same time, they will be limited and defeated if they do not have a transformative logic. That's why then I'm putting forward the idea of both transformation and revolution. Let's go to the next slide, Chair, where I go further on this. As I've said, reforms for their own sake would be reformist. They would be not changing anything other than immediate conditions, but otherwise, they just end up within the system. But still, with those limits, as the left, we cannot ignore them. A worker who wants a higher wage is legitimate and right to demand a higher wage. How do we advance that struggle whilst connecting those demands of workers to systemic change, to the idea of revolution? I'm then also saying there's another part of the axis, transformation. I'm distinguishing transformation from revolution. By transformation, in my view, I mean some significant proto-socialist anti-systemic measures beyond limited reforms. But even those kind of measures would still be within the interstices of capitalism. And if they are thought of in a strategic way, they can begin to build elements of capacity for and momentum for socialism, if you may. But again, even if they have that kind of momentum, they would still not be revolutionary transformation. So today, those kind of transformations I'm talking about is free education, the public health system, land reform, and so on. And we've got the material for us to really think through these things in a creative way, whether it's the COVID-19 crisis, whether it's the municipal crisis, and of course, defeating austerity itself, the universal basic income grant people are talking about, or from a transformative perspective, what would be a different development path from neoliberalism, a wage-led, low-carbon development path. But still, as I'm saying, that kind of transformation will still not be a revolutionary rupture of the kind socialists are talking about, where then we refer to anti-systemic change, which, depending on the political conditions, may or may not include a moment of systemic rupture with capitalism, but ultimately it would be significant anti-systemic change, upsetting the order of things and setting in path what would be a significant, thoroughgoing, fundamental change in systemic and structural terms. Let's go to the next slide. The other elements of this process of left renewal, in my view, have to include knowledge production from below, where we take knowledge away from the universities, from intellectuals, but actually deepen what happens in the shebeens, what happens at church, what happens in the Stockfell, into a real process of knowledge production for the purpose of building working class power. We're not doing that sufficiently as socialists. We allow then the mainstream knowledge to be dominated by discourses that are hostile to socialism. A major element, in my view, also has to be media and culture. We need that cultural explosion we saw the Black consciousness movement birthing in the 70s in all sorts of ways. Now with social media, I think we've got scope to even expand that, because that's where consciousness gets formed, the cultural identity people form on the street, in what they consume, and so on. We're not doing enough in a systematic way in this regard. And of course, the big question is going to be that of the party, as all of us come from political parties broadly as the left. I'm not opposed to the need for a new left party, but I think we should avoid party mania, as has been the case. Let's draw the appropriate lessons from different moments and initiatives to build a left party, because there have been massive disasters, there have been massive mistakes in our South African past on this question. But also, I think the population may be somewhat tired of yet another party which seeks its attention, which seeks its votes, without a real process of learning the lessons and renewal. In my view, that party has to be built on the basis of mass struggle and a new vision of socialism. Let me also be controversial by saying we have to drop vanguardism, the Stalinist nonsense we've inherited from the Soviet Union, and find a way in which there's diversity, there's plurality, there's open-endedness, but a long-term perspective where then we can consolidate our different traditions, our different histories in a more realistic way. And of course, as I continue to insist, that party has to be linked to mass movements without controlling them. And therefore, in my view, this means a broad process of left renewal that would not hurry into the party stage. None of the package I've put forward for left renewal is possible without political education. We need sustained activist development, sustained political education in order to build a critical mass of conscious, confident, capable, and effective activists who can carry forward with the massive tasks that we have. I'm making this point informed by my experience of working with movements. My comrades in the unemployed people's movement in Makhanda, Ekhini, will not kill me when I say, if you took out the top 10, the top 20 of that movement would struggle to survive. Yet that movement has challenged government successfully in the courts, on the streets, bringing thousands of people on a regular basis for a number of years now. And yet I'm making this point that actually we do not have a critical mass of activists that can carry the complex tasks we have that I've set forward in this process of left renewal. Comrades, I hope it was useful. I'll end there. I'm looking forward to the engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Mazibuko. That was really mouthful and quite engaging. You are bringing a lot of dimensions to to the thinking, and I hope that after this afternoon, we would have clarified each other on a number of issues. I think the real question that we should be asking ourselves is whether South Africa is ripe for the kind of change that socialists desire. Because if you look at where we at as a country, we see a predominance of what you call the middle class, which seems to be, especially the black middle class, which seems to have taken over the running of the country and the levers of our economy. And I'm not even sure if we have such. Some of us have even questioned the existence of the black middle class, or what you call, the black petty bourgeoisie, in the realm of politics in the country, taking account of the extent to which they are appendages of, white dominance. They really depend, in more ways than one, on white dominance, and they have to kowtow to whatever white dominance comes up with. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
No, it's true that the black middle class has risen in significance. Unfortunately for it, it does not have generations of wealth. So, as has been said in a joking way, many of them are one salary away from poverty.
Indeed.
But at the same time, there are elements amongst them who have begun to jettison radical ideas, a radical imagination for change in society. There's an article in Politics Web, I forget the author. He is narrating his visit to Soltec. Soltec is the new center started by Solidarity, the right-wing African trade union, and is basically using that visit to condemn COSATU and other socialist trade unions as failing to serve workers. So I'm bringing that example to argue that it would be a mistake to give up on the black middle class because its precarious state means that it will still be subject to the vicissitudes of capitalism. And many of them have organic family and cultural and other relations, social relations with the black working class in any case. So there's work to be done. In fact, the black middle class stands to benefit from a good education system, from a good public health system, from a good public transport system. So many of the demands we're calling for as socialists are actually not to the detriment, but to the benefit, and I would argue, to the transformation of the black middle class.
I don't know, Comrade Mazibuko, we have always understood race. I mean, you did argue in your presentation a lot about the fact that we need to consider race as part of the package of contributors to to discourse as far as we look at what is happening in our country. I'm not too sure whether you still see race as, or are you part of those people who believe that race determines class, and therefore we need to address the race question so that we can be able to deal with class issues in South Africa?
Look, if we deal with race and use race as the main means of change, we would then have a Cyril Ramaphosa as an outcome, a black capitalist. I remember the UDF leaflet called Isizwe. There was a thing of it in 1988, which said, our goal is not to make Walter Sisulu the director of Anglo-American. For me, that struck with me And I think rather what we need to think about is capitalism as the foundation, because capitalism shapes white supremacy and then others, Black people. It is capitalism that then shapes race. Having said that, race is not to be minimized and ignored. Race is crucial. In South Africa, it was the Black working class that was oppressed. It was not the white working class. The white working class continues to benefit to this day from the legacy of apartheid, and it is even better positioned to adjust to neoliberalism, whereas the Black working class is not in that condition. So therefore, what we need, I think, is a dialectical understanding of the interconnectivity between race and class.
And therefore, we have to then deal with both race as well as capitalism, because these are twins of evils that need to be attended to take us forward.
And in that regard, I'm pleased that in the US, there's been a development on the left on thinking about racial capitalism. These are debates that had taken place previously in South Africa, but I think it's time to go back to them, because actually what we have still is a racial capitalism. Once we think of it in those terms, then race and class are interconnected.
I don't know I don't know how you can racialize capitalism, because for me, capitalism is capitalism and race is race. And you know, capitalism doesn't stop being capitalism because there is race. So are you then saying that if we attend to the issue of race, then capitalism is dealt with? Or because I mean, you cannot racialize capitalism. Capitalism is capitalism and race is race. And unfortunately, we have a race problem largely because of capitalism. And the fact that we address, you know, the issue of, you know, race in South Africa in particular, it doesn't necessarily mean that we would have dealt with capitalism. So I have always argued against this racialization of capitalism. And, you know, in my book, we have to deal with both because they are twin evils that, you know, this society needs to deal with.
I think your last point is correct, that we have to deal with both. But at the same time, if we say we deal with both, an anti-capitalist strategy, a socialist strategy that does not explicitly recognize race, I think will be limited, because there is that historical question that has to be addressed, but it cannot be addressed on a capitalist basis.
All right, where do we go from here? You believe that we need to find a way of creating a mass-based movement that caters for all. And I'm not too sure whether it is something that socialists are inclined to want, because, you know, socialists have always been of the view that you dismiss vanguardism, I see, but socialists have always been inclined to believe that, you know, a socialist revolution needs to be led, and it needs to be led by those who, you know, feel the pinch the most. And in this country, it would be the Black working class, as you put it. Where do you put that in your mass-based movement of everybody?
No, when I say mass-based movement, I don't mean of everybody. I mean a mass-based movement of the Black working class, which remains the majority. And by working class, I don't mean those who are employed. I mean basically all of those who have to sell their labor, whether they do sell it or not. All those who have been dispossessed would belong to the broad category of Black working class. So by mass movement, I'm referring to the working class. When it comes to vanguardism, I think as socialists, we have to take stock with that concept, with regards to that concept. There's not a single place anywhere in the world where there have been revolutions, socialist or anti-colonial, where the vanguard has actually enabled deeper democracy, has actually enabled a sustained achievement of socialist transformation. Indeed, the vanguard notion played an element, particularly in the Leninist-led Bolshevik revolution. but it soon turned into a Stalinist tragedy. So I don't think we should treat it as a holy cow that cannot be challenged and rethought. Particularly if we are in a society that is as diverse as ours, but also what could have proved as a barrier against Stalinist degeneration could have been mass movements that are autonomous and independent. In my view, that's very crucial. There are elements of this that exist in South America. For example, the Workers' Party of Lula rode the wave of mass movements, urban and rural mass movements. And even when the Workers' Party degenerated into corruption under Lula, it was the mass movements that carried the banner for socialism higher and higher. That's a very interesting historical experience that I think challenges Vanguardist notions.
I hear you, and I think it's an ongoing discussion, because you always see the dominance of the working class or the majority in any society taking leadership of revolutionary transformation. And in this country, you're not going to be able to run away from the fact that the Black working class are a majority that would be recognized as the vanguard of that revolutionary transformation. Yeah,
I agree with that.
Okay, and somebody is asking a question about the role of African customary system in a revolutionary transformation. What is your view on that? You did touch a bit on the systems of monarchy that exist within our society, but how do you then can you just expand a bit about the role or what we should do with the monarchy system in a socialist society that we envisage?
Let us take one example of justice when there's disputes within a community in a rural context. Historically, and to an extent in some areas today, there would be a community process that starts with the family. If the crime is within the family, there would be an engagement within the family process, but then it gets elevated to different levels higher up, whether it's the community, whether it is the headman, and ultimately the court at the level of the traditional leader. Within that, there would be elements of restorative justice, there would be elements of democratic participation. That's the best when it comes to the best elements. But at the same time, there are retrogressive practices and notions, whether, for example, in some of the traditional courts, women are asked not to look up or not to represent themselves when they argue their case, but to get a male relative to represent themselves. So obviously, this second example is negative, is oppressive, and is not in line with revolutionary transformation of society, and in fact, institution as we have it. So what you've seen actually where there was space was the democratic evolution of customary law. In a region called Kalanga in the past, there's a strong tradition going back to the 1880s of the election of headmen, democratic election of headmen on a regular basis. And now also they've changed that to include women. So those are the kind of things that I think need to be encouraged, progressive and democratic development of customary law. And in my view, when those happen, we begin to rethink customary law in a way that challenges the power of a chieftaincy that was co-opted by apartheid. Because the chiefs we have been, their systems of action, the way they exist is not to be forgotten that it was changed and deformed by apartheid. Apartheid, by doing that, apartheid basically thwarted what would have been a progressive development from below. And so when it comes to the chieftaincy itself, I think space must be allowed for communities themselves to opt out or to opt in, rather than assuming that because one has an ethnic identity, therefore then once it belongs to the Xhosa kingdom, the Zulu kingdom. For example, if you look at the former Ciskei, with the defeat of Sandile in 1879 by the British, that meant that the chieftaincy system largely collapsed in the former Ciskei. And yet people developed new post-kingdom systems of customary self-rule. And now when the ANC tries to return the chieftaincy with laws in 2003, there were significant conflicts on the ground because people were saying our culture now does not include reference to a king. Of course, the ANC continued. And the problem ultimately with the imposition of kingdoms and chieftaincies is the retribalization of society. Because ultimately, the way these kingdoms and chieftaincy were thwarted by apartheid was under a particular form of tribalization and capturing of tribalization by the oppressive system. So now as radicals, as socialists, we must definitely assert our African identity, definitely assert the need to respect and promote African customary law, but on a democratic and progressive basis, and enable opting out.
You know, one thing about a socialist revolution is that of identity, national identity. And, you know, I hear you speak of African identity, and with, you know, the customary law and monarchies being part and parcel of the package of that African identity, which has always stratified society into the different ethnic groups. And here you are arguing for a socialist revolution and a transformation of society into a nation state that would be socialist in its character. And if we have such, how is it possible that these can coexist where you have, you know, a society that is stratified according to, you know, according to ethnic linkages that we belong to and that we have? Is that not militating against the desire to establish a socialist nation state, so to speak?
No, I think the logical conclusion you're pointing to is important. Ultimately, there'll come a contradiction between a socialist nation state and tribal-based entities. There's no doubt. That's why then as socialists, we need to have a progressive approach to nation building, a progressive approach to customary law. So what I'm avoiding, though, is a call from above, the above being socialists, who call for the end of the chieftaincy, and yet ordinary people identify with it. Whereas I think if ordinary people on the ground find the space and room to opt in and opt out, the conclusions are obvious. So for example, people today talk about the Zulu kingdom as if there's one Zulu identity in KwaZulu-Natal, as if everyone who's Zulu in KwaZulu-Natal accepts the chieftaincy and the kingdom. I've spent time in my work working with the rural women's movement in Ikobo, in Ladysmith, and other parts of KwaZulu-Natal, where there's such massive anger against the chieftaincy, against the kingdom. But people on the ground are being tactical and strategic in knowing that the power balance is such that if they were to speak out in particular ways, they would then be exposed and vulnerable to the powers of both the state, but also elements of the chieftaincy which are violent. So I think it's going to be a long struggle, despite our wishes as socialists for a more democratic system that does away with the leadership.
And in that democratized society, what do you envisage? Do you envisage a society that pushes for one-party state, where, you know, people live to the dictates of that party that is, you know, democratized and controlling society? Or how do you see, you know, society organized?
I think we need a multi-party system. It will be a mistake to go back to the disaster that the one-party state was. Chavez in Venezuela won 13 elections democratically, and with each election, his votes were increasing. That's a very important lesson for socialists, how to renew the mandate on the basis of election, not on the basis of competing with different parties. The Communist Party in the state of Kerala in India is very instructive. Over the last 50 years, it has been in and out of power. When they fail, the people punish them. When they do well, the people reward them. And it ensures that they remain dynamic, they remain thoughtful, and they do not rest in the laurels of power. So one-party state does not work with a socialist democracy, in my view.
Okay. No, thanks for that. Let's just go back to the organization of the forces of the revolution. And in this case, we spoke very broadly about the need to reorganize the left and the need to rebuild the mass movement that will then galvanize society towards a socialist revolution. And if we look on the ground, we see a lot of fragmentation of the working class itself, and as well as the lack of leadership, because most of the leaders are, people who are supposed to be helping advancing the socialist revolution, and you see them being co-opted into the neoliberal agenda of white supremacy. How do we then reorganize the masses? How do we reorganize the Black working class into a formidable force of change that can advance, revolution? And you did indicate the importance of political education and the importance of recultivation of the masses towards, that which has somewhat eroded us in this present moment. How do we reorganize the masses? You are muted there.
My apologies. The basic needs of ordinary people, I think, are going to be key. And COVID-19 has attenuated those issues around basic needs: food, water, housing, health. Let's look at the controversial examples of Hamas in Palestine, as well as the Hindutva in India. What both those did in the 1920s was to organize around the basic needs, initially from soup kitchens, but moving on to food gardens, moving on to a community clinic, moving on to a system of community safety for women. It's the kind of stuff the Black consciousness movement was talking about in the 70s, experimented with at some point, the Communist Party in the 90s. So those are very crucial as initial starting points, because once the basic needs of ordinary people are met, even to a limited extent, then we can talk about ordinary people as political actors, as people with agency. If we are disorganized through the search for food, through the search for housing, it's very difficult for one to have agency, for one to become a political actor. So as the left, we really have to work out, how do we address this food crisis? How do we address the basic needs crisis that people are facing? I work with a group called the Inyanda National Land Movement, which organizes about 25 small farmer organizations across the country. In Limpopo, that grouping has been able to meet the basic food needs of people for up to 6 months a year. And now they are asking big questions about why they are limited by failed market-based land reform. But this is what's important for me. But another element is going to be to build real democratic organizations on the ground. Many of the crisis committees that emerge, or the social movements that emerge, are short-term about an immediate issue, and at times even get captured by the ANC. How do we build this as real democratic organizations with their own autonomy, with their own vision? But also key is the sustained political education work to address two issues: analysis and strategy. The problem is not the councillor. The problem is not just corruption, but it's systemic. So we've enabled comrades to make that shift. And then as they make that shift, they then develop the strategic conclusions. For us to get there, it will take that kind of strategy, which will also require that we build unity across geographies, across movements. Unfortunately, the biggest weakness that we have in this regard is the state of the trade union movement, whether it's SAFT, whether it's NACT, whether it's COSATU, because those need to bring their social weight to the zone of social reproduction, the township, the informal settlement, the rural area. They keep their social weight in the workplace without bringing it over. If you remember Moses Mayekiso, when he was leader of both NUMSA and Alex Civic Organization, there was a very direct link between the workplace and the township. We need to rebuild that in a significant way.
Okay. I'm in conversation with Comrade Mazibuko Jara. We are in conversation about advancing the socialist revolution in a democratic dispensation. You are more than welcome to contribute to the discussion either via your comments on Facebook or on the chat group, as well as raising your hands and ask your questions, or give commentary to the presentation that's been made, and all are welcome to participate in this conversation. I know that's great, Comrade Mazibuko, and we really need to reignite this revolutionary program, because if you look at all the gains of struggle, we seem to have eroded all of the gains of struggle. Right now, people who were in struggle prior to 1994, looking at what is happening now, would ask the question: is this what we fought for? Is this a kind of a democratic setup that we had envisaged? And I think the answer is emphatically no. To all of that. Where did we lose the plot?
I think there were several moments where this happened. Ronnie Castles, for example, has used the notion of a Faustian pact, where the ANC decided to accept a neoliberal capitalism as the basis to solve the country's crisis. That was throughout the period of the transition from 1990 to 1995. But also another dynamic that occurred then was us as ordinary people giving up our agency to the leadership. There was a lot of belief in the leadership. And many of us who were grassroots activists did not have the capacity and the means to sustain mass movements as we should have. And then the other moment was when both the Communist Party and COSATU went hand in glove with Jacob Zuma. The crisis of neoliberalism that Thabo Mbeki had introduced had opened the door to mass struggle. If you remember, the mass general strikes of COSATU in the early 2000s. Those general strikes could have opened the door. But also, once the ANC was in power, it could not even tolerate a social democratic program such as the RDP was. So there have been several moments throughout the transition and post-1994 when the ANC made particular choices, but also the left within the ANC made tragic mistakes that have led us to where we are. And I don't think we should bemoan and cry over those. Though that's the history, let's learn the lessons. Let's develop new tools and new strategies.
So would you agree with me that the sunset clause and this two-stage theory that was introduced was a failure from the beginning, that it was never going to be able to advance socialist transformation of our country?
I'll be controversial on both of those. I've read the documents of the Communist Party quite closely. And what is amazing about those documents is that nowhere is there the use of the word two-stage theory. The two-stage theory often arises by people on the left who are critical of the Communist Party. So it's just a minor quibble. But more importantly, though, you are right to say, ultimately, the strategies followed by the Communist Party through its reliance on the ANC for its socialist program was fundamental in shaping what we eventually achieved, because it meant that the agenda, the program of socialism was not put out to society in the way it should have been by a communist party. So whilst I'm critical of the phrasing of the two-stage theory, I think the Communist Party has to acknowledge its shortcomings in that regard. And then when it comes to the compromises, look, I think this has to be approached at two levels. One, the main political agreements that were reached about keeping white civil servants for 5 years, about the government of national unity, having the Nationalist Party in government, and to an extent, the formulation around Section 25 of the Constitution. Those were short-term compromises, in my view, that would have been overcome. There is nothing in those compromises that leads to gear. There's nothing in those compromises that needs to market-based land reform. Those neoliberal policies of the ANC were political choices the ANC made. And there were big debates about how far change could be possible. The second level I was referring to then are what appears to have been secret agreements, where then the Transitional Executive Council, which are not necessarily open to public scrutiny, even within the ANC. For example, the loan in 1993 from the IMF, or the decision to join the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff. So that's why I'm saying let's make it a two-part distinction in the compromise that was achieved. The political compromise to transition from apartheid to democracy, I think, was not a barrier in itself. Different choices could have been made. But I think what ultimately proved the barrier was the power of capital through that IMF loan and other deals that were made that we do not know of. That we still have to uncover.
Yeah. All right. I saw a hand. Was it Madwa? I'm not sure if he still wants to make his input. Let me just give him an opportunity to speak. Madwa, if you can just unmute and make your input.
Hi, Budi. Comrade. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, Cde Mazibuko. I'll be very brief, comrades. I've tried earlier on to submit this question, but bear with me, I'm going to try and refine it with an objective to source a direct response from Comrade Mazibuko. Okay. There's this perspective of in the previous revolutions, Comrade Mazibuko, or attempts at that, about forces marching separately and striking together. I'm raising this because I want to highlight the pain that I have regarding the fragmentation of the left within our country. From where you are sitting, Kulwa, what do you think perhaps is the main factor that is facilitating the so naked and painful fragmentation of not only the Black working class formations, but also the left existing political organizations, some of which are not necessarily, they would not necessarily regard themselves as Black, you know. I need just clarity there.
Thanks, Paul. I think a major factor is the fact that we've allowed our historical ideological divisions to continue, whether it's Trotskyist versus Marxist-Leninist, whether it's Black consciousness versus others, and so on. We've allowed those to continue, and we've maintained our narrow political identities, even at times when the mass struggle was requiring that element of striking together, as you are pointing out. I'm not calling for a dissolution of all divergences or different perspectives, but we need to pay much more attention to unity in action than to differences and divergences. We're not doing that sufficiently. We keep to our flags as if these are historically set forever. And then the other thing, which I think is a major confusing factor for the broad working class in this regard, was the socialist rhetoric of the Communist Party and of COSATU. So people still thought that their objectives are represented there, and then they would not then dare to rethink the socialist project, or even how them as the working class, their goals would be met beyond accepting that rhetoric. And of course, then you must not forget the impact of the Stalinist legacy on our politics. I know you are a member of the EFF, you'll criticize me for saying this, but both the EFF and the NUMSA movement did not free themselves of the legacy of Stalinism in framing the struggle, or even in characterizing the forces for change, or even in shaping the vision. That Stalinist legacy has then meant we have not, EFF and NUMSA and others did not then find pathways to a revolutionary perspective that would embrace engagement with other left forces.
Mm. No, thanks for that. Comrade Mazibuko, as part of the solution towards rekindling the left renewal, you are proposing a mass-rooted process. What is the role of the liberation movement towards this mass-based or mass-rooted process of renewal of the left? Do you still see the present revolutionary liberation movements as factors going forward in the struggle for socialism?
I'll make a distinction between the ANC as a liberation movement and other liberation movements.
Okay.
When it comes to AZAPO, the PAC, the New Unity Movement, as components of the liberation movement, I think they have the benefit and advantage of not having been messed up by neoliberal governance and corruption.
You think so?
at least in the public eye. At least in the public eye. So there is some kind of revolutionary morality that lends credence and credibility to those organizations contributing to a process of left renewal. And in that regard, I think a lot of what I've said about rethinking, learning, and unlearning would apply. For example, notions about democratic centralism, notions about federalism. I would challenge as for the PAC, the New Unity Movement, to rethink those, and also the question of feminism and eco-socialism as part of the package. When it comes to the ANC itself, I think institutionally, the ANC is rotten. It cannot be reimagined as a contributor to left renewal. I think that the ANC as a factor for emancipation is gone. However, there are committed patriots and socialists in the ANC, in the Communist Party, and in COSATU. And I think the challenge has to be to reach out to those, and for them to open up to a process of left renewal, because many of those comrades in there have tended to keep the ANC and Communist Party flag as the first priority, rather than opening up to beyond their prison. The process, I don't think, can ignore that there are those forces still within the ANC and the Communist Party, but institutionally, ANC is gone as a force for change.
Mm-hmm. So we need to recruit those people from the, because you see, they still represent the masses, and the majority of people, those people who you say must be reorganized, they cry every month about the social ills that affect them, and yet they still continue to vote for the ANC. Why is it that these people that we want to transform society cannot find it necessary to delink themselves from the ANC and see it as part of the problem rather than part of the solution?
Look, I think that ground is shifting with what we've seen with the EFF. However, because there's no serious left party, that ground is not going to shift further. I think it's still going to be limited to some kind of protest vote for the EFF or not voting. Look, people, I think, stayed with the ANC as long as they did because they made a historical investment in the ANC. Their grandfathers, their grandparents, and the history, and of course, the symbolism of a Mandela, the symbolism of a Chris Hani, of a Joe Slovo, and so on. Well, we're quite powerful, and we're going to take some time to wear away. But with the coming into being of new generations, I think that ground will shift further. This is where then the challenge is for the left, to pose an alternative that really is about the serious transformation of this country.
We use sometimes we use this interchangeably. We need a revolution. We need transformation, and you also introduce the concept of reforms. And socialists and reforms, they tend to diverge a lot of the time. You seldom hear socialists talking about reforms. Why do you think that it is necessary to introduce reforms as part of the package of social transformation?
Partly because reforms are concrete. People right now want concrete things to change their conditions. The schools must work, there must be public transport, there must be no violence against women, the worker demands a higher wage, and so on. Those are important reforms in the here and now. And whilst I'm saying as socialists, we must take part in those struggles for reforms, I'm also saying we don't take part in those struggles for reforms for their own sake. We take part in those struggles in order to ensure that the broad sections of the working class can learn from those struggles of how the system works and can then demand more. Because those reforms in any case will be rolled back. You may have won a significant increase of a wage in December 2019, but in March 2019, your job was gone because of the lockdown. So the reform you won was rolled back in its entirety. So the purpose of engaging in reforms is actually to expose the working class from its immediate demands to revolutionary perspectives. I'm not saying from the outset that the demand must be reformist. In some instances, you do get very transformative and revolutionary demands, but it's rather rare rather than the norm.
Look, I mean, I hear you, but often in the process of revolutionary transformation, there are certain things that will be reformed along the way. And I do think that, the messaging and the terminology that should be out there should not be about reforms. It should really be about revolutionary transformation. Because I mean, once you say, no, we need to reform this or that, nobody's going to commit to that revolutionary agenda because we know it is not a revolutionary agenda. But as part of the revolutionary agenda, there are certain things that will be reformed along the way without necessarily saying we are engaging in a process of reform, because reform by their nature, as you say, are very reactionary because they don't advance the cause of the revolution.
I think that's a better formulation you put forward than my formulation. I'm happy with that.
Okay. All right. See, I can't believe we've run out of our time. Your concluding remarks?
I'm very thankful to AZAPO and the participants for this platform. I hope it triggers a renewed process for all of us to find each other as the socialist left and for us to rebuild from this towards a real process of renewal so that ultimately we can defeat both neoliberalism and capitalism. I look forward to continued engagement, comrades. Thank you.
No, thank you for gracing us on this platform, Comrade Mazibuko Jara, and it was a wonderful conversation to have with you, and I look forward to future engagements with you. Let's continue the political education.
Amandla.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody who was participating in this conversation, and we look forward to continuing these conversations next Sunday, 1 o'clock. Let's meet then. Till then, thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.